So I got 5 minutes into recording this before I realised I hadn't pressed record. I love it. So I know that there are tree branches across my face, but it's a beautifully sunny day. I am absolutely going to be sat outside to record, and I am going to be sat under a shady tree, so we can all deal with the fact that I have kind of a dynamic lighting effect going on my face, because it is beautiful today. And today I am recording this video in York Cemetery. It opened in 1837, and it is a wonderful example of a Victorian garden cemetery. I mean, just look at all of this life around me. It's so vibrant and it's so full of nature. It really is wonderful. And it's one of the nicest places I think I've been to where you can enjoy commemoration and death and burial practices. It's a very #death positive place to go. I hope Caitlin over at Ask a Mortician is okay with me co-opting that hashtag. I have been working in commemoration and the archaeology of death and burial and commemorating the dead for years and years and years. That's what my PhD thesis is about. And I thought it was about time we did a video looking at how people buried their dead in the Viking Age. So the question of how the Vikings buried their dead is kind of a nuanced one. It's nuanced, baby. Always nuanced with this channel. It's nuanced, baby. And you know it's going to be nuanced because I'm talking about it. But there are lots of websites that say things like the Vikings cremated their dead, or even most Vikings were cremated. But is that what the archaeology supports? We'll kind of dig in, to that in a second. But the thing it's important to remember is monolithic answers like the Vikings cremated their dead aren't helpful. They're misleading. And a lot of the time, those statements are made for ulterior motives, to try and get people to buy things or do things in a certain way. There's actually a form of cremation vessel called an osseberg, and I'm not saying they're doing this deliberately, but the osseberg ship is an inhumation. There are 2 women's skeletons buried there as full human bodies, not cremated. And that's just the kind of thing that people on the internet will read, especially people who aren't specialists, might be misled by. So it's a thing you have to be careful about. The vast majority of the time when we find a Viking Age grave, we'll expect to find an inhumation. We'll expect to find a body. Inhumation means into the soil, rather than a cremation, where the body is incinerated, and then the ashes and the bones disposed of, usually in a vessel, an urn of some kind, right? We're all familiar with urns, with ashes on people's mantelpieces. I have my dad's ashes in my front room at home, which is feeling increasingly weird. But we have nuance, baby. So later texts, Snorri Sturluson and the Eddas, I'm looking at you, tell us that Odin wants you to be cremated. Odin wants cremation burials. And yet, most of the time, in Viking Age and Norse settlements, we find inhumations. We find people buried. And we find free men, enslaved people, men, women, children, all buried. All inhumation burials. So what does that tell us? Does that tell us that the text is wrong later on, and that this is just a later made-up thing? Does it tell us that people were ignoring their religious requirements? Does it tell us that it's not that crucial, and that in terms of the metaphysics of the soul, a human body is just a vessel for the spirit, which is going to go up to meet the gods anyway, so it doesn't really matter what you do with the body, it's more important what happens before and afterwards. What you do when you're alive, and how people who are left behind treat your spirit, or how your spirit is treated in the afterlife. My money is on the last one. My money is on, to the Old Norse, it was less important whether you were cremated or buried. It may have been personal choice, family tradition, the particular god cult that you followed. We don't know because they didn't write it down. And maybe it was just, okay, well, when you die, if you've been a brave, good warrior, you might go to Valhalla. If people follow all the funeral rites afterwards, that increases your chances even more. Good luck. How do you want your body disposed of? It's also Almost certainly because before the 19th century, where we get industrialized crematoria, so these high temperature, high efficiency crematoria that start appearing in the 1890s and 1900s, cremation is hard work. Like, cremation took a lot of fuel, a lot of people, and a lot of time to do well, to do it efficiently. You don't really want to be waiting around for days for a body to become ash. You want that to be done on the day if possible, and that takes a lot of time, effort, and fuel. In places like Iceland, where trees aren't really a thing, you're not going to spend all those resources on burning one corpse. That's just not effective use of a very limited resource. There's an interesting parallel here with Zoroastrian sky burials, so exposure, where a body is simply left in the elements for the elements and for animals to take care of. And in India, in particular, the vulture population has been decimated through the use of drugs in cattle. They eat the drugs, they die from diclofenac poisoning, which means that sky burials don't work anymore, because a flock of vultures previously would help that happen in minutes, and now it's taking hours, days, weeks, and that's just unacceptable. So yeah, I think that there's an element of preserving resources, there's an element of religious flexibility, let's call it that. Let's call it, Odin doesn't necessarily care if you are cremated or if you're buried, right? He cares that you are observant in however that worked at the time, which we don't know for sure how that worked. If anyone tells you we do, they're lying. And it depends on what you did during your life. Like the whole point of that Valhalla target is you have to have died in battle and been a heroic warrior in some way, at least according to the texts that we have, most of which are later. So the actual archaeology that we have is really interesting because a lot of the generalizations that have been made over the last 100 years are now starting to kind of be challenged a little bit. And one of those generalizations is Christians are buried without grave goods, pagans are buried with grave goods. And that's not always the case. We do have Christian burials with grave goods. A notable example is clergy burial. And for a great example of that, we look at the burial of St. Cuthbert, who is buried in a highly decorated coffin with a book. And the St. Cuthbert Gospels is a fantastic book in a crimson-dyed goatskin cover with moulding and different coloured paint on it. It is an amazing piece of early medieval bookmaking. It is, I think, in the British Library still on display, and it's well worth a look if you're ever there. But this is a man who has died. He is a Christian. He has been buried. He's a bishop with a book in his coffin. He has goods in his grave with him. That's grave goods. Now, obviously, the purpose of the book being in the coffin with him is come the resurrection, when his body is fully resurrected and he stands up, he can then use his gospel book to preach to his flock on the great day. So that has a religious purpose. It has a Christian religious purpose. He has this book so that he can fulfill his duty, and when he is resurrected facing his flock, he can immediately start preaching the gospel and the good word to them. So that's an example. All right, it's a choice example, but it's an example of a Christian being buried with grave goods. We have pagan burials without many grave goods or any grave goods. Some of the burials we have, for example, at Cumwhitten, have very few goods. They have some personal bits, some personal accessories here and there. Some of the graves, even earlier graves at Sutton Hoo, very few grave goods. Now, is that just because the person being buried is poor? Or is that because the person being buried didn't really need many things? We don't know. Is it because of inheritance and people had already taken all of the stuff that they wanted from this person and they were just buried in their clothing? That's slightly cynical. I kind of hope that's not the case, but we don't know. This is the problem. We do know from rune stones that if an Old Norse person is buried, after a week, the inheritance starts to be sorted out. And we also know from rune stones that that inheritance can go from a man to a woman. So an uncle can give all of his possessions to his niece if he wants. A husband can give it all to his wife. A son can give it to his mother if the son predeceases the mother. That can and did happen. We know that that happened. And one of the big examples of a richly furnished inhumation is, of course, the Osseberg ship burial, where we have the skeletons of two women wearing silk-trimmed dresses and tunics with tapestries, a full ship. Some of the Disneys Icelandic ship burials also are full boat burials. They're in boats because they've got hundreds of rivets there. But we have things like, as I mentioned, the Myklebost ship, which was a full warship with shield bosses and shields in situ. We have weapons, and then we have a funerary urn, a cremation urn, inside the ship. What does all of this tell us? It tells us that there's a mixture. There's a mixture of stuff going on. There's a mix of funerary practices happening in the Viking Age. We also know that many Norse people and many Vikings, when they settle, adopt local customs really quickly and enthusiastically. This is where I start talking about Ibn Fadlan. So I haven't talked much about Ibn Fadlan right now. Jimmy, why haven't you talked about Ibn Fadlan up to now? It's because Ibn Fadlan is very much a specific case. He is talking about a Rus funeral on the Volga. He even mentions that the people here are called Russia. These are the Rus people. And the thing about the Rus, by the time Ibn Fadlan visits them in the 10th century, is they have adopted lots of local customs. And we're talking about artistically, culturally, and funerary customs here. One of the things that they have in this funeral that he mentions is basil. Basil's highly unlikely to be used in Old Norse funerals, that's a magpie, in Scandinavia or in the British Isles, because you just don't get it. It's being used in this funeral on the Volga, possibly because it's part of the local funerary custom that's being adopted by the Scandinavian Rus, and then over the years and over the generations, more and more aspects start to get added to it. We also, obviously, in Ibn Fadlan's account, have an unfortunate situation where there is ritualized sexual assault, which is not mirrored in other sources that we have, and there are other aspects as well, like full male nudity, that suggests that these are different to what's going on in other parts of the Viking world. There are obviously similarities. It is a ship burial. We know that other cultures practiced ship burials. The Anglo-Saxons practiced ship burials. Sutton Hoo, as a great big example. Other Germanic places seem to have practiced ship burials. One of the things we seem to see happening a little bit less is these really, really big animal sacrifices happening in burials in the Viking Age. We do see them here and there, but not many on the same scale as, for example, the prince that was found about 5 years ago in Sachsen-Anhalt in Germany, who was buried with 11 animals. And we're talking oxen, horses, dogs. He's got weapons. He's got gold coins from the reign of the Emperor Zeno. He's got a beautiful, pristine glass bowl. So the adoption of local customs and the combination of religions is sort of a syncretic thing. Syncretism is where religions are combined, basically. And in Great Britain, we have things like the Carlisle Cemetery, which is pretty much definitely full of Scandinavian people who seem to have adopted the Christian grave goods sterile way of burial really fast, because some of these people are being buried at the same time as Norse people in Cumwitten with very different styles of burial. So in Cumwitten we see lots of grave goods, we have people in different positions, and in Carlisle we have lots of people facing west to east without many grave goods within what is an established monastic cemetery. So what's happening here? Why are people being buried in a Christian fashion? Well, because they might be converting to Christianity. They might find the idea of being buried in a nice enclosed cemetery really appealing, makes grave robbing less likely. But the answer is we don't really know. And the problem with all of this is nobody's writing this stuff down at the time. Nobody is writing things down like, make sure that I am buried in an extended supine position 6 feet below the earth in a wooden casket with no grave goods. No, nobody's writing that. Nobody's saying that. Nobody is saying, make sure that that's how I'm buried. So it would be super useful if people were doing that. People tend to do that a lot more nowadays, but it's hard to know. If you want my opinion on it, I think people are converting to Christianity, and there is a lot of syncretism going on. We have things like the crosses from the Isle of Man, and Cumbria, and Wales, and Ireland that have Old Norse pagan and Christian symbolism on them. I think that syncretism means that people are more open to different ways of burial. You don't necessarily have to be buried in a crouched position or a contracted position with your hands under your head, with lots of grave goods to help you in the afterlife. Maybe you don't need that. You don't need a physical body. Physical bodies can be cremated, so why would you need physical items? Yeah, that makes sense. I'll go with that. Just, you guys can fight over the stuff afterwards. Just chuck me in a box. Like, maybe that's happening a little more. What can we conclude from all of this? We can conclude that earlier in the Viking Age, yes, we have more graves with more grave goods. People are crouched, people are cremated, people are buried in inhumation burials. There are large strings of beads and brooches in women's graves. There are lots of weapons. There are tools in men's graves and in women's graves as well. See Oseberg. But later on, there tend to be fewer grave goods. People are buried in inhumations, and they're buried in a supine, extended position, so they are lying flat on their back. Is this the same in other cultures at the time? Well, that is another video, because I also plan to do an Anglo-Saxon burial video, and I'm going to do a Welsh burial video, and they're going to be fun. But we do know that the practice changes over the Viking Age. So we're talking 200, 300 years here. Things change, culture changes, and the Old Norse adapted very quickly to other traditions, other religions, and influences on their culture. They did. That is not a point that is even worth debating anymore. They did that. They, at the drop of a hat, adopted local customs wherever they went. It's why the Volga funerals definitely looked different to the Danish funerals, which looked different to Norwegian funerals, which looked different to Hiberno Norse funerals in Ireland, which looked different to Hiberno Manx Norse funerals on the Isle of Man, that looked different to Hiberno Cumbrian Norse funerals in Cumbria. They all look different because wherever you go in Europe at this point, everything is slightly different wherever you are. And that isn't a new thing. We know that different places in the Roman Empire had different ways of worshipping the god Mithras. It happens, there's local variation. But the Vikings, by and large, kind of buried their dead however they wanted to or however they could. If you have lots of trees, maybe you cremate them. If they're wealthy, maybe you cremate them. If they have lots of possessions, you give them grave goods. If you are Christianized, you don't need grave goods. If you're not Christianized, maybe you really want those goods to go to your children, you don't get buried with them. Nuance, baby. I really hope you enjoyed this. There's some extra reading down in the comments section and in the description there. And if you have a favourite Viking Age burial, let me know in the comments. But I hope you found this useful as a little sort of introductory overview. And I hope that you take away from this that there is variation, there is nuance, and there are different things happening all over the place at the same time. So diolch yn fawr iawn am ymuno. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm going to go and reapply my sun cream. And thank you so much to all of my patrons for helping me get a new microphone. I've got a new microphone coming, so diolch yn fawr am hynna. If you would like to support the channel financially, we've got the Patreon, we've got the coffee, and by all means, like, subscribe, and join me next time. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you very much. Tan y tro nesa, hwyl fawr. Till the next time. Bye-bye. Oh, so sunny. Ooh, two for joy. So many magpies here. It's lush. God, look at me. I'm so streaked with shadow, like Arnie in Predator. Smear mud on yourself.